All right, want to welcome everyone. This class of Noahide laws. Again, want to welcome everyone. This class of Noahide laws. And sorry for the delay. It's not my fault. It's the server. Gonna blame it on the server. Right, it's all your fault. Anyway, let's get started here. We're talking about obligations last week. What are the obligations? You know, at what age is a Noahide obligated in? Is it different than a Jew? This week, a very, very hot topic. And a topic comes up a lot, and that is what's a non-Jew's obligation when it comes to honoring parents. So we understand, obviously, there's certain relationships, right? There are boundaries between certain relationships, between men and women, king and subjects, let's say rabbi and students. But what about a child and the parents? Right? It's an important relationship, no question. Now, we know one of the 10 commandments to honor your parents, right? Honor your father, your mother. We know that in Exodus chapter 20. So the question is, what about Noahides? You know, Noahides obligated in this mitzvah also. Now, seemingly, even though this mitzvah would make sense logically, in non-Jews, Noahides are going to be obligated anyway. You know, if it's something that is, something that's going to be logical according to the Torah. But seemingly, they're not obligated. As it's stated in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16. So there are four places in the Talmud that discuss this. Sanhedrin 56b, Bechoros 8b. And says over there that the Jewish people accept the 10 mitzvahs at Mara, right, in the desert. Right. In other words, if you look at Exodus chapter 15, verse 26, discusses the commandments given there, and other places, commandments were given as well. That they were given 7 commands to Noah, plus additional new mitzvahs of Shabbos, civil laws, and honoring parents, honoring a father and a mother. Now, when it mentions that, this means that the Gemara separates commandments of Shabbos, civil laws, and honoring the parents from the universal Noahide law. So what would that mean? Simply, it would mean that these commandments are not for Noahides, not for non-Jews. Gemara in Kedushin 31a asks Rabbi Eliezer, what is the extent of honoring the parents of kibbud avim, honoring one's parents? He replied, go and observe the behavior of a certain non-Jew, an Ashkelon named Dalma ben Nesina. Now, interesting, learn out obligation on the parents from a non-Jew. So sages, what do they want? Sages wanted a certain precious stone for the breastplate, for the ephod, one of the priestly garments, priestly vestments. And they were willing to pay him 60,000 right, for 60,000, whatever the value, 60,000. I don't remember what the term was for the value over here. But what happened? The key to the chest where the stones were kept rested under the father's pillow. So Dalma ben Nesina didn't want to disturb his father's sleep in order to retrieve the key. So the following year, he's rewarded with a red heifer. Right, the value of the red heifer was far more than these jewels, if you see Numbers chapter 19. Rabbi said, we see the rewards of one who's not commanded, and just imagine the reward of someone who is commanded. So therefore, what do we see? That Dalma ben Nesina's observance was voluntary. It wasn't obligatory. It was voluntary over here. So therefore, you're going to be obligated in the command. Now, there are a lot of questions on this story, just in general. First question is, imagine, your father's sleeping, person's father's sleeping, someone knocks on the door and says, listen, you know that car out there? I'm willing to give you, $100,000. Oh, sorry, my father's sleeping, I can't ask him. Things are jalopy, right? Someone's willing to pay him $100,000. You don't think his father would say, what are you, crazy? Wake me up. Could have made $100,000. Right? This car's a hunk of junk. Right? No question. Okay, you're right. You're right that he didn't want to wake up. Do you think his father would have cared? You know, that kind of money, huge sum of money. Huge. So, in either case, he didn't want to do it. And he got rewarded with the red heifer. The red heifer, he could have made millions. And he said, I'll take whatever you're willing to give me for, you know, these stones. Right? But it's still a huge amount. So, what do we see? In any case, what do we see? The command over here was not obligatory. It was voluntary. Right? 100%, it's voluntary over here. Now, the Gemara in Nazir, right, in Nazir 61a, that Rashi and Tosfos over there point out that the assumption is, no, it's not obligated. Same thing. So you see 3 different cases where Noahides, seemingly no obligation. No obligation to honor their fathers and their mother, even though you could say we learn out this great honor that's done to parents through a Noahide. through a non-Jew. Now, maybe there's another source. So, the Torah tells us honoring the parents does not apply to Noahides, so not obligated. Right? But as we mentioned before, Noahides can observe any mitzvah that is compelled by logic. Right? Something makes sense logically, according to the Torah. Now, according to many rabbinical authorities, observance of these logical commandments would be obligatory. Why? Because it makes sense. Totally makes sense. Now, what would we say? What can we possibly say? Why do we have to? Why might they be obligated? If it makes logical sense, because we should have gratitude. The gratitude of parents brought us into this world. You're going to say my parents beat me. You know, my parents were evil, so to speak. So that's the whole question. That's the whole difference of opinion. If a parent's evil, you have to honor them. Right? Respect, another different issue. Right? Honor means I have to stand up for them. I can't contradict them, so to speak. But even if they were evil, doesn't mean I can what's the word? I can make fun of them, you know, embarrass them. They may deserve it, doesn't matter. You're not allowed to. Honor, you might not have to. Right? Honor, seemingly you wouldn't have to. Right? But again, you can't debase them. You can't make fun of them. Right? You still have to be careful. Now, what about logically compelled mitzvahs? So, Rav Nisim Gaon, his introduction to Talmud tractate Brachot says, regarding all those mitzvahs depend on reason and nature of the hearts, all already obligated from time God created man from the generations of fall. So it says Rav Nisim Gaon over there, there's an obligation. There's an obligation to honor, to keep any mitzvah that makes logical sense. Right? That, again, it depends on reason and nature of the heart. It makes sense. Says Rav Saadia Gaon, same thing. All men, Jews, Noahides, compelled by force of reason to do good and pray for their needs. Right? That he brings down in Munahides, chapter 3, number 1, over there. So, most rabbinic authorities would agree. Noahides are obligated, logically compelled mitzvahs. Now, the question is, okay, if it makes logical sense they have to keep it, what's the level of obligation? Is it like I'm 100%, like a non-Jew, a Noahide would be 100% commanded to do it, or it's just good advice to do, but they're not 100% commanded over here, right? Right. So we're going to ask over here, is it an obligation or liability? So it's not clear to say Noahides are obligated in logically compelled mitzvahs. It makes sense, no pun intended, right? Definitely makes sense. Maybe they should be. But it could be that's better to say they're liable for logical mitzvahs. Now, you asked me the $2.5 million question. What's the difference? Is it semantics? What's the difference between obligated and liable? Now, the city of Sodom was destroyed for nullifying the practice of charity. And they were extremely cruel, as Gemara says. Sanhedrin 104b. Extremely cruel. Right? So, Comes along Rav Avram Grzinski in his book Torah, Seichel, and Noshi. Right? His work called Torah that makes sense to the human mind. And he says that Sodom was not punished for insufficient charity. Right? That wasn't the issue. What was the issue? They rejected the concept of charity. Right? Now, if you think about it, if a person has money, that doesn't mean they have to have a lot. Person has money, and someone's in dire straits, someone needs help. Doesn't it make sense? If you have money, you should help them. You would think that, there'd be an obligation to help if you could. Now, Sodom, and many other examples, the Noahides are liable for punishment over here for actively, communally rejecting mitzvahs, compelled by logic, right? But what about being proactive? What about being proactive over here? Are they liable if they're not proactive? I can understand they don't do it, right? They reject it. It's one thing. What if they're not proactive? So the active performance of such a mitzvah, we said, voluntary. Certainly not obligatory. So a person can decide they want to do it or not, right? So a person can decide they can perform it according to the laws that we do, right? According to Jewish law. Now, the question is going to be, where does honoring parents fit? Over here. Comes along the Sefer HaChinuch, number 33. Right, Mitzvah 33. The Sefer HaChinuch is a book, we're not exactly sure who the author is, but it's a book that goes through every mitzvah in the Torah according to the parsha. So mitzvah number 33, he says in no uncertain terms, honoring parents is logical. Logical. And he says it's appropriate for a person to recognize through kindness with those who have done for him. Someone did kindness for you, you should do kindness with them. Right? You shouldn't act as a degenerate, alienating those who have helped him, being ungrateful, one of the worst things you could do. For this is a bad and completely repulsive trait, both before God and man. Right? In other words, someone helps you, you should help them. Right? You don't help them, you're an ingrate, essentially. So you have to remember his father and his mother are a cause for him to be in the world. Right? Biology 101, we're going to keep this clean. Right? So why shouldn't a person be obligated to honor his mother and father? They brought him into the world. People say, they did this to me, they did that to me, did the other thing. Okay, but in general, right? In general, if, they're nice people and they helped you along the way, that, you should be grateful. So therefore, in truth, you should accord them all the respect and benefit for the sole reason they brought him in the world. Again, you could have questions on this. What about parents are abusive? Well, okay, right? But let's say they're not. Let's say in general. In general, shouldn't a person be 100% grateful they're brought into the world? I don't know. Maybe some people will be upset. Maybe they'll say, "Yeah, it was a bad thing they were brought into this world." All right, whatever, right? But in general, what will we say? You got to be grateful. They brought you into this world. Comes on to say for Chinuch further that honor one's parents is a means by which one comes to recognize, appreciate the goodness that God does. Right? It's not just, I gotta honor my parents. You have to respect them. Yeah, but it goes further than that. Because you honor your parents like you honor God. Right? Similarly, rabbis tell us there are other parallels. Because it said, honor your father and your mother, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. And then it says, honor the Lord, Proverbs chapter 3. Right, 9. The Torah equates honor due to his parents to the honor of God. To the honor due to God himself. So it says, every man must revere his mother and his father. Keep my Shabbos. I'm the Lord your God. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3. It also says, the Lord your God you shall revere. Deuteronomy 13, verse 4. The Torah compares reverence of parents to the reverence of God. Also, it says, he who curses his father and mother to be put to death. Exodus chapter 21, verse 17. Also says, whoever curses his God shall bear his sin. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 50. So what does the Torah do? Torah is equating cursing parents, cursing God. Right? So what do we see? We see that there are three partners over here. Three partners in creating an individual. Right? So rabbis teach us three partners in creating a person: God, Father, and a mother. Right? Father, mother, biology, right? 101. 101A, God puts in the soul. Right? So you need all three. So, person honors his father and his mother. God says, I credit them as if I dwelled among them. Unbelievable. The fact that, you honor your parents is like God dwells among you. Thomas said before of Nachman, right? It says in Kedushin 30b to 31a, when a person curses his father and his mother, God says, I did right not dwelling among them. If I dwelled among them, they would have cursed me too. God says, yeah, I know my creation. If I dwelled among them, if he's cursing his parents, for sure he's going to curse me. Right? No question. So you see, there's a connection between reverence to God and reverence to parents. So another thing, that the mitzvah is to honor. It says honor one's parents. It doesn't say love them or any emotional obligation to them. Interesting distinction. Because what the chinuch say, he says we're obligated to honor our parents because there's a basic human obligation to show gratitude. Now, some people say, oh, my parents did this, my parents did that, and later on in life, they have nothing to do with it. Right? They're ingrates. Right? I'm saying, not saying that they were abused or other things. Parents are who they are. They're not perfect. Right? Certainly not perfect. Certainly can make mistakes. Right? There's no question. But what about gratitude? How can a person not show gratitude? Now, over here, what's the implication? Pretty mind-boggling idea. The implication is a person should love his parents, right? But only that is not the same as honoring. Right? Now, again, doesn't say, sorry, I said it backwards. That doesn't say he shouldn't love his parents. But all it says is he's got to honor them. Now, if he's got to honor them, wouldn't it mean he's got to love them? Maybe. Not necessarily. Now, a lot of times, unfortunately, what do we see? We mentioned before, parents and kids don't have a good relationship. But you know what? God says, I don't care. It doesn't change anything. That the Torah ideal is for both Jewish and non-Jewish society. That's obligation-based, not right-based. Right? That's also a big difference. In other words, the parent has no rights to a child's respect. They can't say, you have to respect me. You have to honor me. Well, guess what? That's not going to work. Over here, the child has an obligation to show that respect. They owe that respect. That's true. The parent can't demand it. Now, the obligation doesn't come from the parents. Where does it come from? God himself. Now, what happened, which is probably, a common thing, or potentially, a common thing, and that is, what if the obligation is mitigating the relationship is strained? Right? What if the relationship is strained over here? Person would have to jump through hoops to honor them properly. And they may even think they don't have to because of things they've done. Now, the person is going to have to work hard over here. It's a very hard command to do. Very, very hard command to do. So, the more effort it takes, the more precious the mitzvah is. Right? In other words, the amount of effort you put in is what you get out. Right? So the harder it is, the more merit you get. But if the relation between them, let's say, is bad, it's abusive, or, and a person, it's just, a lot of fighting, a lot of yelling and screaming, and all that, so that might be a different issue. Right? So there, you got to seek rabbinic as well as probably professional counseling in such a case, where you may find out you don't have an obligation, and it's better to stay away. As we said, you have to be in toxic relationships, right? And that's a whole discussion of itself, right? That person chooses his path, family may go by the wayside. A Jew that becomes religious, wasn't religious before by a non-Jew. They want to, be Noahide or convert, they're tremendously strained, right? Certainly. So, makes it a lot more difficult. You want to show them the right path, they don't want to listen. They make fun. I have cases of people, right? I have a few cases of people, the parents, one is a Noahide, the other process of conversion, and the parents are rabid anti-Semites. That's a hard thing to deal with. I get this question a lot. I've spoken a lot in my Q&As. How you deal with that? Right? How a person's supposed to deal with that. That's hard. I mean, there are Jewish anti-Semites also. A friend of mine became religious, and parents totally cut him off. His father never met his wife and his kids. His mother did, but, it's like they totally cut him off. Like, so much, for being open-minded, right? Or at least intellectually honest. But yeah, they, saw this person as a fruitcake, and they cut him off and said that, you want to live that life? Great. We're going to have nothing to do with you. Right? It's, the person didn't do anything wrong. They reconnected. They didn't want to have anything to do with him. Okay, it's their choice. Right? So it can be very strained. Very strained. And a lot of times, maybe it's better not to have, not to speak to them so often. But if it is strained, you got to be careful. You definitely have to be careful. You still have to show respect. Right? So what happens? They're going to yell and scream and this and that. Okay, so you can't yell and scream back. You got to be, you got to be bigger than that. But at the same time, it's painful. There's no question. So sometimes that, not only that relationship strained, better not to have a relationship. It's just better. That's not what the Torah, that's not the ideal of the Torah, but, what are you supposed to do? You can't, bang your head against the wall till it bleeds, right? Obviously, it's going to be bad. And if you know this is going to be bad, it's going to be toxic, it's like saying, I need another hole in my head. Okay. Who needs that? It definitely can happen. There's no question, right? So, if a person's in such a situation, you got to get rabbinic advice, probably professional counseling also. How to deal with it because it can drive you nuts, right? It can be extremely unhealthy. Now, we mentioned before, parents cannot demand respect or honor, right? We said before, I'll just throw this out there. It says, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3. It says, every man must revere his father and his mother and keep my Shabbos. I am the Lord your God. What's the juxtaposition of the verse? What's the connection honoring your parents and keeping Shabbos? Right? There's always a juxtaposition. You always have to see what's going on, etc. So why these two in the same verse? The Rashi, others say that if a parent tells you that's a great Shabbos, you don't listen. You have to honor God. You have to listen to what the Torah says, right? But some people say, "Hey, doesn't it say one of the 10 commandments honor your mother and your father?" You're right, 100%. But if they tell you that's a great Shabbos, God comes first. They're not going to want to hear that, but that's the truth. God comes first. So there's certain things you can't do. They don't like it, so you can say, "Go eat kugel." You don't like it, okay? You gotta be respectful. But if they tell you, you got to obligate, we want you, that's a great Shabbos, you can't listen to them. The Torah tells me one of the 10 commandments to honor your parents. Okay. But it gets superseded over here, right? That's what it's doing in the verse over there. Now, a parent, we said before, cannot demand respect. And if they do, and they demand that a child honors them, what's going to happen? Very simple. Child's going to be alienated. Right? They're going to alienate him. And that child, is going to hate them. It's going to despise them. Parents going to say, "Look at all I did for you. You owe me." What's the child going to say? The child's going to feel like a piece of dirt. Right? Obviously, not good education. Parents should be forgiving. Should overlook occasional slights. Not an easy thing to do, depending on what the kid did. And you got to train your child gently. You can't insist the child to honor them. Right? So you can't insist the child to honor him, but their mother. But a mother should teach the children to honor the father also. So even if they have a strained relationship, the father can say, all right, at least, you have to honor your mother. Me, you can do whatever you want. Her, different issue. Also, speaking to a child, parents should never command him or order him about. Oh, that's demeaning. Totally demeaning. Right? You do it in a nice way. Speak nicely. Do you mind getting me this? Can you please take out the garbage? Whatever. Right? You got to do it in a nice way. You can't demand. Now, parents also could say, I don't want my child to honor them. They have a right. Parent walks in the room, child stands up. You can say, you don't have to stand up. Don't worry about it. You can absolve yourself of that. Now, what if a child wants to honor them anyway? Even if they've been absolved. So that's praiseworthy. Even if the parent says, no, you don't have to do it, but they want to do it anyway, they're allowed to. At the same time, if a parent allows, the child to forego his honor, that's good, as long as the child does not insult them or abuse them. And I can tell you, I've seen this a lot, in the secular world. See how kids talk to their parents. Horrific. Now, remember years ago, before my kids were older, I saw, they were Jews to boot, I don't know, 14-year-old, 15-year-old, I forget how old this person was. Just totally spoke back, made fun of the mother, in front of other people. In front of other people. I was like, fucked. So I asked the mother, I said, you going to take that from your child? I was like, no, that's what kids do. No, it's not what kids do. It's wrong. It's obnoxious. Kid to abuse, insult a father, parent. It's horrific. Now, if a person's father or mother asks for something at the same time, who gets first? The father needs to take precedent. Why? Because the mother's got an obligation to honor the father. So therefore he comes first. If let's say, this is also common, what if parents divorced? Both request, their child at the same time. But they're not living together, right? So seemingly, the child can honor whoever they want first. Now, a person's married. Then a married woman's obligation to her husband takes precedent over that of her parents. Right? Now, this is something that's sometimes hard. Why? Because a woman, usually much closer to her parents, than a guy, usually. So, she's going to want to take her parents' side before her husband, or do things for her parents before her husband. So comes on the Torah says no. She's got an obligation to take care of her husband's needs first. He comes first. Right? That takes precedence. Right? Also, it's appropriate to show honor to a person's in-laws. Now, the question is how far that goes. But, honoring parents, obviously, takes precedent. And what if a person doesn't get along with their in-laws, which certainly can happen. So you got to be careful. You definitely have to be careful. What if they say negative things about you, about their daughter, this, that? It can be a situation also. Right? So, it's a lot easier normally, when a person has kids. Usually, if a person has kids, and even if they don't get along with their in-laws, it's better. Because then they just deal with the kids. So, it doesn't make it as, toxic as long as they know their place. They know not to interfere in different things. But there are a lot of problems where parents get involved, in a child's life where they have no business getting involved. They overstep their boundaries. I was at my Rebbe once, first time in the basement, right, in the rabbinical court. There was a really messy case, divorce case. Right, the parents were there, the grandparents were there, both sides, yelling and screaming, this whole thing. I was like shell-shocked, sitting there. Anyway, they told people to wait outside, and through a side door, they brought in, like a therapist, who's been working with them, whatever. And they said, can you save this marriage? He said, yeah. He said, there's only one problem. He said, what's that? He said, the parents are interfering. If the parents wouldn't interfere, I could save the marriage. Right? Parents, sometimes overstep their boundaries. So I have 4 daughters. I have 4 daughters that are married. So I told each of my son-in-laws, before the wedding, I said, when my daughter walks down the aisle and, goes under the canopy, goes under the chuppah, she's all yours. 100%, she's all yours. I said, you get the whole package. I said, if you ever have questions, whatever, I'm here to help, whatever I can do. I'm not getting involved. Totally not getting involved. Someone said, you really said that? I said, yeah. I want them to know I'm not overstepping my boundaries. They want help. They want this. I'll do whatever I can. Whatever is possible. But to get involved in their personal life, certainly not. Unless it's absolutely necessary. Thank God it has been necessary, right, in general. So, but I make them know, you got the whole package here. Good luck. Good luck. Children are obligated to honor their father's wife, right? Stepmother, as long as their father's still alive. And doing that honors the father as well. Obligated to honor their mother's husband. Either isn't their father as long as the mother's living, same way, right? So if it's a stepmother or stepfather, they have an obligation to honor them, right? Because that's an honor to their mother or their father. Now, is there an obligation to honor a step-parent after the passing of the parents? Let's say the father dies, stepmother's still alive, right? So you don't have an obligation, but it's a good thing to do, right? It's definitely a good thing, to have that connection, of all things being equal, and honor them as well, as much as you can. Now the question is, how does it apply to grandparents? Here we're talking about the honor for parents, right? The question would be, okay, what about grandparents? What about grandparents over here? So honoring one's parents takes precedent. But with parents and grandparents, let's say, are all in one room, grandfather's need takes precedent. Because the father has got an obligation to honor his father. Right? So if that's true, then even the father wants something, grandfather wants something, grandfather comes first. Because the father's got an obligation to honor him. If one's father or mother has a designated spot to stand for certain gatherings or for regular prayers, you can't sit in their seat. Forbidden for a child to stand in the spot or sit there. Right? At home as well. A child can't sit in a place that was for the father. Right? Standing in the place that the parent sits, however, is permitted. But if the parent allows them to sit there, they're allowed to. But in general, it's a special place for the parent. If a parent has a specific chair, let's say not a specific place, or a particular piece of furniture, also can't sit in it. Because even if it's moved out of its usual place, doesn't matter. Right? It's got it's got the stamp, so to speak, of the father or the mother, whatever it is. Person can stand on a parent's chair for a moment, let's say, you gotta, change a light bulb or something like that. So, okay. That's okay. Sitting there is a different issue. Using it for something, that you'd be allowed to. What about regarding the parents' seats or, that apply to where they sleep? So, no question if that's true or not. So we hold that you asked the parent before, sleeping in their bed, right? But in general, they're probably not going to mind anyway, right? So, it should be okay, but you should ask anyway. Should a child or son-in-law take his father into his home to live with the family? That's also a good question. What's the level of obligation? No obligation, right? No obligation over here for the father to be seated at the head of at the table, right? Taking care of them, something else, right? Maybe we'll get to that, right? But there's no obligation, it's on his house. Father should sit at the head. Perhaps the son or son-in-law can keep his seat at the head of the table. Nonetheless, father should be seated next to him, close by. So where the father-in-law comes, let's say for visit, for Shabbos, some have the custom to seat the father at the head of the table, or allow him to lead the meals, right? Just like he'd be in his own house. But you don't have to. The child or son-in-law, they can sit at the head of the table, and the father sits nearby, or father-in-law. So it's a custom also, right? It's greatly praised because it sets a precedent for children and grandchildren are present, right? So in other words, some will say that, if a grandfather comes or great-grandfather comes, you sit him at the head of the table, right? But you don't have to. Right? You definitely don't have to, but, it's considered praiseworthy if you do. When the food is served, the parent should be served, even though son and son-in-law is the head of the household, right? Because again, the daughter has an obligation to honor the parent, right? Take care of the parent's needs first. But she's obligated to her husband. True. He should really come first. Nonetheless, we say over here that, it should go to the grandfather first. Children are obligated to stand for their parents when they enter a room. We mentioned that. But you don't have to do it once during the day, once at night. You don't have to do it every time they walk in a room. Right? You don't have to do it once. If the parent forgoes it, then they don't have to. What if a parent's blind? Interesting. What if a parent's blind? So it's still an obligation to stand up for them when they enter the room. Even if the parent can't see. Even if he can't see. Right? To honor one's parents doesn't depend on the parent being aware of the honor. Right? That's what it seems over here. If parents sleeping, children shouldn't wake them up. Unless it's, an emergency. But if the reason is to prevent a monetary loss or some other direct benefit, you're allowed to. Right? That would make sense. Because the parent want to be woken up in such a case. Can the child wake up the parent for the sake of a mitzvah? Yeah. Wake them up, from a nap, going to synagogue, whatever. They're allowed to. Can't refer to or address their parent by their first name. That is the ultimate embarrassment. Calling a parent by the first name. You can call them, my father, my mother, dad, mom, whatever. Abba, Ima, whatever, father, mother in Hebrew, whatever it is, but you can't call them by the first name. That is disrespect. And that would apply even if they died. Right? Dad said this, or dad said that, or mom said this, whatever. Right? But only, even after they die, you got to show respect. You can't, just call them by their, by their first name. Speaking to a parent, speak to them nicely, softly, respect. How would you speak to a king? You're not going to speak in a loud, gruff voice or whatever. Can't contradict the parent. Right? You can tell them, even if they say something wrong in Torah, you can say, well, I think the Torah says like this, or the Torah says like that. Can't contradict them directly. Right? That's an insult. Right? Even if they blaspheme, you can't. You have to say, this is what the Torah says, they'll figure it out that they're wrong. Right? Or maybe they won't, but it doesn't matter. You can't say it direct. So a parent had, let's say, a verbal disagreement with another person, and the child says to the other person, I agree. I agree with you. That's also contradicting the parent. It's also going to be forbidden over here. Right? So you can't do it in public. According to some other rabbinical authorities, only in the presence of the parent. Parent's not there, maybe you could. You can say, yeah, I agree, even though my father says otherwise. Others say, no, not even the presence of the parent. Right? Even if the parent's not there, still disrespectful. Even if you agree. So keep it to yourself. Not everything should be repeated. Right? If the issue we said before, it's a Torah discussion, and the child has clear-cut proofs against his parents, then rabbinical authorities allowed the son to contradict the father even in his presence. But it's got to be respectful. Right? Can't be obnoxious. It's got to be respectful. If the parent asks the child, let's say for their input in the discussion, they can give it. Right? That's not an issue. If a parent does, so we said this before, this is what I meant. Parent or says something that's against Torah, or does something against Torah. Right? Child should not say, hey, that's a Torah prohibition, I'm allowed to do that. Right? What's that going to do? It's going to cause the parent to be embarrassed. Totally be embarrassed. Rather, what should a child say? So a child should say, doesn't say in the Torah like this, that a person shouldn't do this. In a way, it sounds like a question, not a rebuke. Right? In other words, they'll figure out that, the Torah says like this. So you got to allow the parents to realize on their own. They certainly made, the error. But you're not stuffing it in their face, so to speak. And you're not telling them directly, oh, look, see, you made a mistake, see this, whatever. You got to do it in a nice way. Also, what about an elderly parent? Now that's take responsibility. To care for an elderly parent if possible. They have to make sure they have food, they have drink, appropriate clothing, arrange for the parents' transportation. Again, not an easy thing over here. And really, you shouldn't have anyone else do it. The child should do it. Right? 100%. You should have a caregiver do it. Child should do it. Also, child should do it, a pleasant approach. Don't look at it as a burden. Right? Even if a person provides parents with the finest food and all that, do it in a good way. Don't get angry. You get angry, punishment can be very severe. Now, if that's true and a child takes care of the parent, what about the cost? So they have to take on the cost of doing such a thing. So the answer is, right, the cost of doing so, does not need to be entirely, on the child. Child can use the parent's money. Right? The parents have money. Child doesn't have to take their own money. They can use the parents' money over here. If the parents, let's say, they don't have money, right? They don't have any money. They can't afford food. The child can afford food. Child has to give them. You got to pay for it. Courts are empowered from this standpoint of Noahide law. They can force a child. Because if the parents are starving, they have no food. Child has to take care of them, right? Especially if they can. Now you don't have to take it on your own. If you have other siblings, you split it. Depending on, how much a person has. If some of the siblings have poor obligation to provide, falls on those who can bear it, right? In other words, the person's poor, you can't say, okay, go into debt in order to help, support our parents. You don't have to do that, right? In other words, if someone has enough and someone doesn't, the one who has enough should take care of it. 100% they should take care of it. You don't make someone go in the poorhouse more if they don't have. Also, child's obligated to personally do things that are requested of them by a parent, whether, has nothing to do with whether money related or not, even if it's indirectly cause them a monetary loss. Now, I know I probably doesn't have to go that far, right? But if a child, is asked to do this, that, and the other thing, it might cost them money, so they should do it. And intending to a parent's need to express it over another positive mitzvah. And if you can't do both, parent takes care. You take care of them first, right? 2 mitzvahs, one can't be done. Whatever, you don't have enough time. Whatever the parent wants, that's what you do. You take care of their needs first. Now, what happens if a parent has issues? They have, they're mentally challenged, or not mentally challenged, but they have They have psychological issues or whatever. They're insane or otherwise incapable of thinking intelligently. You got to try and treat the parent respectively. It's not such an easy thing. Let's say the parent has dementia. They don't know who the child is, or they say all kinds of terrible things because of the sickness. It's hard. They still should try to attend their needs, as possible. But again, if you need to get professional care, you're allowed to. You're definitely allowed to. And when caring for such people, you got to remember, even if it's hard, remember when we were kids, which we don't remember so much, but they took care of our needs. So if they can't take care of their own needs, we should definitely take care of them. They cleaned us, they bathed us, dressed us, they did all these things. So we got to take care of them also, even if they can't. Right? We have to reciprocate. So Talmud tells us in Kedushin 31a, and the Code of Jewish Law, Shulchan Aruch, Yeridea 7240, Halacha 3, give the following example. If a son's dressed in finery, sitting at the head of the table, presided over congregation, his mother or father approach him. It's pretty nasty. What do? He's giving a lecture, let's say. A parent comes up and they tear his clothing, clock him over the head, spit in his face. Okay, they're insane over here, right? Can't do anything. Can't retaliate. Can't insult them. Now, if they're violent, you can protect yourself, right? You can never strike a parent. Certainly not, right? But if there's no other way to stop them, you'd be allowed to. All right. Instead, you got to remain silent. Fear the King of Kings was commanded him to do so. That's very hard to do. Very hard to do. Now, the question is, how does that work today? So many rabbinical authorities hold, when is this going to apply? Parents suffering from dementia, right, which we mentioned, or Alzheimer's or anything similar. Why? Because they're not normal. In such a case, the disease has overcome them, and they're not normal. Obviously, normal parents want to behave better, or they should, right? They absolutely should. So, you're not obligated to bear such insult, but, if you're in control, right? The parent is in full control of their faculties, nonetheless. They spit at you, other things. You can't say anything. Can't do anything. Right? Mind-boggling. That's how far it goes. So this applies even if a parent is well, even if they're not out of their minds. You can take action, we mentioned. You can take action to prevent them from creating such a public spectacle. That you can do. And if they attack you, you can, fend them off. You just got to be careful not to make a wound or anything. Right? But once the attack starts, child has to bear it in general. Unless it's violent. Unless it's violence. Now, we mentioned before, if a parent is wicked or abusive to a child, so many rabbinical authorities hold child doesn't need to suffer and take it. To defend themselves, rebuke the parent. Right? Because they're evil. If they're abusive, they don't have to take it. The child should do anything necessary to save himself from abuse. Again, you need to contact your local Orthodox rabbi or therapist or both in order to know how to, know how to deal with this. Someone grows up, parents are narcissists. Total, psychological abuse. Total psychological abuse. How much does the child have to take? So we say in such a case, if they're evil, then who says I have to honor them? Right? I have to respect them. They're doing terrible things. Right? So that's, you can rebuke them. And again, you got to be careful. Then we have to be careful. But at the end of the day, seemingly you should be allowed to. But, in such a case where this is so toxic, you do whatever you can to save yourself from the abuse, even that means you never talk to them again. Right? And it can happen. If stories, parents abuse, grandparents, this, that, or just grow up in messed up houses. A lot of people grow up in messed up houses. So the idea is, you really have to ask the question, what to do in such a case. You might have to go for, therapy. It's not an easy thing. Not an easy thing to deal with. Right? But these are the general rules of honoring parents, and one of the things we see. Right? It's not an easy mitzvah to do. We see that, certainly Noahide should have an obligation from things that are, that logically would make sense. But we wouldn't say obligation over here. In other words, liability. Right? As we mentioned before. Yeah, so take any question. I mean, it's a big topic. This is a topic, a lot of questions come up. Especially regarding parents. What do you do where, like I said, I have a few cases, parents are anti-Semites. They're abusive. I'm not saying physically, necessarily. I know one case that was like that. It was physically abusive. It was someone who was Jewish that they were afraid if they didn't, listen, to the father, and he made him desecrate Shabbos, the father would smack the heck out of him. This guy, his father was much bigger than him. Smack the heck out of him. He's afraid. Totally afraid. Yeah. So, thank God this person got out of Dodge. He got out, got out of the house in Yeshiva and whatever, hopefully doing good. But, person grew up in a messed up place. So that, you gotta get help for. How to, first of all, how to deal with it emotionally. And then, from a Torah perspective. But you would think, well, if someone's that abusive psychologically and they say these terrible things, you can't say anything. You can't answer back. You got to be respectful in a certain way. Right? But according to what we just said, if they're abusive, which it sounds definitely like abuse, you can shut them up and say, all right, I'm done. I'm not talking, we're not talking about this. That's it. And if they keep saying it, I know someone, stuck in that situation, or, still stuck at home. Right? But, parents they're rabid anti-Semites. That's a hard thing to deal with. Tremendously hard thing to deal with. So I speak about this topic quite a bit. And I tell people, it gets so bad, you just got to tune them out. Or look at them like they're totally insane. That was the best advice I ever got. You got to look at people that they're insane. And they deserve to be in a psychiatric ward. So if someone's mentally challenged, they have a 25 IQ. Why, if they bump into me and slobber over me, so it's not so nice. But at the end of the day, you're going to get upset by it. They got 25 IQ. They're mentally challenged. So these people have more than 25 IQ, but they're also mentally challenged. They're Torah challenged. So I'm going to get upset because they say things. Sticks and stones. Right? That was the best, probably one of the best advice I ever got. Don't take these people seriously anymore. I just deflect it like Teflon. Someone makes an obnoxious comment. That's it. Deflect it. I had something a few weeks ago. Someone made a comment, stung. It was a stinging comment. I opened my mouth. I probably got, a lot of merit for not opening my mouth. Could have given a lot of blessings at that point. Right? Well, that's if you get embarrassed in public. If you get embarrassed in public, you don't open your mouth. You can give blessings. Or if someone got embarrassed in public, you get a blessing from them. Right? Because when you don't say anything, you get all the reward. Unbelievable reward. Right? So someone made a comment, and I could have said something. Now you have to understand, I got a big mouth. Is most people probably aware. For me not to say something, that's a huge thing. Not even to make any comment. I know it's not going to go anywhere. It's a waste of time. It stung. I'm not going to say nothing. It stung. If it would have been years ago, it would have stung for a while. Okay. The person said it. Moved on. Was it hard? It wasn't as hard as it used to be. Teflon just went pink, knocked it out. What are you going to get upset about? The person's insane. People can make insensitive comments. Okay. That's what people do. I'm not saying everybody, whatever. It's what people do. So I'm going to sit there and get totally upset because this person is, is Torah challenged. I'm not going to lose any sleep. People jump up and down. How can you say that? It's not worth it. They're not going to listen. Especially imagine the parents are anti-Semite or whatever. Not going to listen. Totally not interested in listening. Care less what you have to say. Right? Especially if you're a child. Right? Who's going to listen to their child? They're much younger than you, less life experience, different things. They're not going to listen to them. Right? In general. They listen to you. Oh, because I have what to say. I don't care. So, that's one easy way. Easy way. You just look at them mentally challenged and you let them say what they say and you move on. All right? Don't, you're going to answer. It's not going to matter. It's not going to change anything in general. Yeah. So any questions? Any questions on any of that? Okay. You can do that. You can send me an email if you want. Yeah. You have any other questions? Well, change the names to protect the innocent. Definitely get that. Yeah, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem.
Yeah, no, I was I was laughing out loud after you said the last thing, but yeah, I do have some questions. I have two questions specifically about it.
Okay.
But yeah, it'd be better to ask, I think, because if anybody else, hopefully, yeah. So if anybody else sees the class, yeah, I don't necessarily want to put everything out in public, but yeah, definitely have two questions. I want to try to email you as soon as I can.
Okay. That sounds like a plan. Great. So I guess I got a class in a few minutes. So I guess if there are no other questions, then I'm going to sign out. Anyone has any questions, again, you can certainly feel free. To shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out. Wish everyone a good middle of the day, almost end of the day for me, and everyone have a great rest of the week.
You are currently the only person in this conference.